Hey, Fortified Hills, thanks for joining us tonight for another table talk in our series over the summer. Josh and I are privileged to be joined tonight by Dr. Tommy Kidd. He is the research professor of church history at the Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City, Missouri. If you have taken any of our cohort courses, you've probably read one of his church history textbooks. He's a prolific author and historian. He's written biographies of Franklin and Patrick Henry and Whitefield, and most recently Thomas Jefferson. We can talk about that some. His primary research interests deal with American religious history. In fact, he has a book called America's Religious History that you should check out. We'll make some recommendations of his books at the end. But Dr. Kidd, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, one of the things I love about Dr. Kidd is not only is he kind of at the apex of his profession as a historian, but he also is a church nursery worker, which will bless all of our folks immensely. We want to aspire to those kinds of ideals, and I know we have a lot of our CC families joining us as well. His sons at one point in time were came through CC during their education process. But Dr. Kidd, we want to talk a little bit about America's founding, especially as it relates to Christian influence in America's founding. I know you must get this question all the time. Was America founded as a Christian nation? How do you answer that or begin to answer that?
Well, of course, like all such questions, it depends on how you look at it. I mean, if say you were able to do a poll in 1776, at least among white people in America, that I mean, 99% of people would identify as some sort of Christian. Now, whether that means they're born again or not is another question. But America is an overwhelmingly Christian place, culturally, legally, in terms of ideas about right and wrong and morality and law and all that. So it's easy to see that Christianity has just a deep, pervasive influence on what America was at the time of the American founding. Um, but that doesn't mean, for instance, that all the founding fathers were Christians, certainly not born again believers. Some of them were, some of them clearly weren't, some of them were in the middle. And I think that there is one really important way in which we were not founded as a Christian nation, which is that we decided in the Constitution to not have an official national church, which from a Baptist point of view is a very good thing. We don't want a state-run denomination, right? But it's an important issue to understand, what the term separation of church and state means and what it meant at the time of the founding. When you think about America's background, which legally was British, Britain had the Church of England, which was an established church, and that meant that it had special legal protections and received tax support. So that's I mean that's a very clear relationship between the government and Christianity. Britain still has that today, of whatever good it's done for them as far as the life of the church. That the Church of England is the official national church, and that's the case in a lot of European countries. And so we decided as a nation to emphasize religious freedom, free exercise of religion, as the Constitution puts it, and that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, as the First Amendment puts it. And so that's a kind of separation of church and state that I think Christians, conservative Christians, should be welcoming towards, because we do not want the government involved in directly running a church. We don't want the government calling balls and strikes theologically about, whether the Baptists are right or whether, Presbyterians are right or whatever. But that was the tradition that America was born in, is that if Christianity matters, then you should have an official national church. And America decided instead to emphasize religious freedom. So that's a specific legal sense in which we were not founded as a Christian nation.
So that's a, I think, super helpful distinction between kind of an established state church, but then it's undeniable too about just the influence Christianity had. I mean, it was kind of the water everyone swam in. And so, what were some of the ways you see Christianity influencing the founders, the ideas that are kind of being propagated at the time of the revolution, while then also distinctly stopping short of kind of establishing a state church? How do you see Christianity kind of interplaying there?
Yeah, well, I mean, you see it, for instance, in the Declaration of Independence, where the if you want to make the argument for independence and for equality of all people, you immediately go to theological arguments because that, as you said, that's just it's kind of fish and water. I mean, it's just the world that we inhabit. And so you don't just say, well, everybody's equal because that's what we prefer, you know, which I think is basically where secular culture is today. But no, you say all men are created equal and they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And that is a very powerful theological statement. Now, we don't want to oversell it. It's not specifically Christian. You could call it sort of Judeo-Christian, but it definitely assumes the existence of a creator, a created order, and so and that claim would have caused no controversy at the time because it of course, God created us. I mean, even Jefferson, who is quite skeptical about Christian doctrine, if you asked him, well, where did humanity come from? He would say, well, somehow or other we were created by God. I mean, like what?
Hmm.
They live in a pre-Darwinian world where, they don't have an intellectual option of saying, well, impersonal forces over billions of years created humanity for no particular purpose. I mean, no one's ever heard of that,
Right.
right? And so they live in a world where they assume that people are created by God, that God has instituted a moral order of right and wrong that should be ideally reflected in law. So when you come to arguing for something as grave and important as the American Revolution, they just naturally turn to theological arguments, citing the Bible. I mean, I could give all kinds of examples of ways in which I mean, we know now that in the arguments for and against independence in 1776, the Bible is the most commonly cited
Yeah.
text, and it would be shocking if it was any other way. I mean, because your average American, is not reading Enlightenment philosophers and everything. I mean, they're reading the Bible, and so if you want to speak to the people in 1776, you cite the Bible. So the Bible's influence, Christianity's influence, is just everywhere in 1776.
I think
Can you help
that's,
us?
go ahead,
Go
Kurt.
ahead, Josh.
I just think that's super interesting. I've heard you talk about the knowledge of the scriptures is pervasive,
Yeah.
uh, but not necessarily that people are born again Christians. Even like there would be non born again Christians that know the Bible better than probably most of the people in our churches do, and that became just kind of the language of the time. And so you do see that woven all throughout. I'll maybe speak a little bit just on like how pervasive was actual scriptural text, even in revolutionary documents or just kind of the kind of cultural language. But it doesn't necessarily equate to all of these are born again Christians. I think it's something weird for us now. Like if we heard people talking that much about the scripture, we would assume, oh, they must be Christians.
Yeah, and it can be confusing because, for instance, Franklin, who I wrote a religious biography of, he probably knows the text of the Bible better than any of the other major founders. He grows up in a Puritan family in Boston. He's the oldest of the major founders, and so his parents are Puritans in Boston. and just lives this Bible saturated childhood. He says that by the time he was 5, he had already read the whole Bible through, which is pretty precocious. But I think Franklin was a precocious child, and so Franklin just knows the text of the King James Bible like the back of his hand. I mean, he just has a lot of it just functionally memorized. He certainly knows it much better than your average churchgoer does today. And yet, Franklin, kind of a classic story of deconstruction. I mean, in his teens, he gets exposed to deistic writers and becomes, he says in his autobiography, a thoroughgoing deist. Um, I know we've had this recent movie about the Great Awakening and Franklin and Whitefield, which I take it oversells a little bit Franklin's religious commitment as a result of the Great Awakening, because we know that Franklin, to the very end of his life, says he doesn't believe in the divinity of Christ, and so I mean, by definition, he's not a Christian. Even though he does have this very close relationship with George Whitefield, who's the most important evangelist of the Great Awakening. Franklin's closest sister is a devout Christian and evangelical, and Whitefield talks to him about the Lord, and don't you need to put your faith in Christ for salvation? And Franklin, as far as I can tell, keeps him at bay. But if all you knew was that Franklin is able to quote scripture at will and quotes it constantly in his speeches, including the Constitutional Convention speeches. And Franklin, one of the strangest episodes in Franklin's life is him proposing prayer at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, a motion which the convention does not adopt. I mean, in a lot of Christian circles, you get the first half of that story. Oh, look, isn't it wonderful? Franklin proposes prayer at the convention, but he was one of the only delegates who thought that was a good idea. So, anyway, he's a strange sort of deist, because he, especially as an old man, he clearly believes in God's providence, but he doesn't believe, and he tells us, he doesn't believe in basic Christian doctrine. Jefferson's the same way. I mean, Jefferson knows the Bible well, not as well as Franklin, but Jefferson even reads the Greek New Testament and the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, regularly. Evidently, as an adult, even as president, he just reads, the Greek versions of the Bible. Apparently for personal edification, while he also tells us he does not believe in the divinity of Christ or the Trinity, and he just simply doesn't believe that Jesus is the Savior, and so it would be easy to get kind of mixed up about these people if you just take sort of bits of evidence by themselves and say, oh, well, they know the Bible. That means that they're a born again believer. No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you probably don't know anybody like, Franklin or Jefferson. Maybe some liberal, Bible professors or something that you had at Auburn, or like I had at Clemson. I mean, I had these guys who they know the Bible really well, but they teach you can't believe it. So anyway, just knowing the Bible doesn't necessarily mean that you're a Christian.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. One of the things I appreciate about the way you write history is it's honest in its complexity. And for folks, I know that there can be a tendency as we read historical figures to kind of sort them into, friends of ours or enemies of ours, who's on our side, who's not. How you talked about evaluating and thinking through what they actually said. As you're looking at a founding father, you've written biographies of multiple of them. How do you evaluate? What evidence are you looking at to try to assess their faith? For somebody who may be, this is new to them and they just thought, look, I read a Bible verse, that guy's probably a Christian like me and probably a Southern Baptist. Where are you as a historian looking? What are you paying attention to as you read what they did, as you read biographies of them? to sort of assess their faith. Obviously, we can't perfectly assess anyone's heart. The Lord does that. But as we're reading, say, biographies of Washington or Jefferson or Adams, what are things that you would pay attention to if you're reading those things to try to figure out what they actually believed?
Yeah, I mean, some people are easier than others for sure. I mean, with Franklin, uh, fortunately and unfortunately, I mean, somebody asked him about a month before he died what he thought about Jesus,
Mm.
and we have the record of his answer, and he said, I'm not convinced about Jesus's divinity. Well, unless something changed, in the next 5 weeks before he died, I mean, this is not good.
Yeah.
But with most people, you don't have, handy evidence like that. I mean, with the major founding fathers, it runs the gamut from, our Patrick Henry, who I wrote a biography of, is not always that forthcoming about his faith, but especially in the last decade of his life, he made it very clear. He was concerned about Thomas Paine, another one of the founding fathers, was becoming increasingly, viciously anti-Christian in his writings. And Henry decided to really come out strong and say that that's wrong. The deists are wrong. The critics of Christianity are wrong. And I want everyone to know that, I'm a devout Christian. And so, with someone like Patrick Henry, you know for sure, especially at the end of his life, that he's a committed Christian. Um, it gets the toughest, I think, with people like Washington. Um, and we still have, live debates today about Washington's faith. And the problem with Washington is that he clearly believed Christianity was a very good thing, and essential for the life of the Republic. And anytime the topic came up, he said, our religion is, essential for America's future and for morality, and we can't do without it. But he almost never said anything about his own faith.
Mm.
And, he attends church, but apparently won't take communion. Um, it's hard to know because he never explains like why he won't take communion. Maybe he struggles with feeling unworthy, or maybe he has some hang up about what that represents or something. But you kind of have to read between the lines. And, some Christians will say, well, he thought it was really important for people to pray. And Washington was a man of integrity, so therefore, surely he prayed. And there's, a million accounts of people, happening upon him in the woods at Valley Forge and finding him pray. But, you would feel better about it if you had direct evidence from Washington himself
Mm.
about, what he believed and his own, devotion to the Lord. I mean, I tend to think he's probably some sort of, moderate Anglican Church of England, what became of Episcopal, Christian, but you just wonder why wouldn't you take communion? As a pastor, I would have loved to, like, you can take communion if you believe in the Lord, But anyway, so there's just some questions that we won't know until we go to heaven.
No historical event happens kind of in a vacuum. There's things that are leading up to that and all. And I know you've also written on the Great Awakening. How does the Great Awakening play into kind of the thoughts of the day, right before the revolutionary moment?
And maybe
Yeah.
maybe define Great Awakening for us just to help us know.
Yeah, Kurt might have that question, so make sure Kurt knows.
Yeah. So the Great Awakening is the biggest revival that happens in colonial American history. In some ways, it's the biggest revival in all of American history. Um, in the 1730s and 40s, and George Whitefield is the most important evangelist, but um, also Jonathan Edwards is the great theologian of the Great Awakening. And then on the British side, John Wesley is working on founding the Methodist Church, and So those are kind of the key players. But when you think about it, the Great Awakening is happening, say, 30 years before the American Revolution. And it's not only the Great Awakening is not only a big religious event, but it's a huge social and cultural upheaval. And its effects are not limited to kind of inside churches. And so Whitefield um, is regularly preaching to crowds that are bigger than the size of the town that he's in.
Mhm.
At one point, he gives a sermon in Boston, and Boston at the time has 17,000 people, and there's probably 20 or 25,000 people at this revival meeting. I mean, so the whole society is swept up into this revival, and we think that probably at the end of his career that something like 75% of the colonists had heard Whitefield preach in person, which is just so. To put it in a nutshell, I mean, we don't have anyone who's even within shouting distance of that kind of notoriety and celebrity in America today. And which is amazing thinking about what a celebrity-driven culture that we live in. Um, Anyway, so whatever America is on the eve of the revolution, I mean, it's influenced by the Great Awakening. I mean, it's just obvious that if this is this massive, titanic, uh, transformative event, and among other things, certainly makes America more Christian on the eve of the revolution, and in particular more born again evangelical on the eve of the revolution than it had been before. I mean, that has something to do with the revolution. Um, Now, as usual, I wouldn't want to get too exuberant about this. I mean, the revolution does seem to have something to do with like taxes and parliamentary sovereignty and things like that, which may have religious implications possibly, but are not immediately religious. So I don't think we want to say that the Great Awakening somehow caused the revolution. But eh, there are ways in which you can see the awakening's influence. I mean, the most important speech of the revolution is Patrick Henry's Liberty or Death speech in 1775, and that uh, even people at the time said that it was like being at a revival sermon, and Henry had grown up going to the revivals of the Great Awakening in Virginia. And that the Liberty or Death speech is just full of citations of the Bible. Um, so and Henry's critics said, "Well, Henry, he must think he's a preacher or something. The way he talks, we don't need that." And so the way that a lot of the most powerful patriot orators and writers spoke and wrote it is in kind of that evangelical revivalist cadence, and the use of the Bible is a very obvious a parallel. But I also think that the Great Awakening, I mean, people forget about the Great Awakening that it's a popular uprising. Um, it, it, the authorities think that the Great Awakening is a dangerous thing. I mean, because the revivalists, especially the really radical ones, I mean, they're busting into churches and condemning the pastor and saying the pastor is going to hell and all that. I mean, they have to regularly call out the sheriff on these people. Um, there's one point in Connecticut in 1742 where they have to call out the colonial militia to suppress evangelical rioters. So it's a dangerous, menacing, popular uprising in some of its extreme cases, and it has this kind of populist echo of what ended up happening in the revolution too. So I think there must be a kind of conditioning influence of the Great Awakening on the revolution, but not causal.
Mhm.
That makes sense. You mentioned earlier too, as the founders thought about religion, they made the decision not to establish a state church, and you said Baptists have much to be grateful for there. For folks who may not know kind of Baptist history, and perhaps we're just raised in the South where the Baptist, Southern Baptist Church is fairly ubiquitous. Tell us a little bit about what Baptists were thinking during the time of the Revolution. Why does it matter? I mean, that logical connection you made that, look, if we're a Christian, most of us are Christians, then that should be the law of the land. That has some appeal today. So why should Baptists maybe be wary of that? What were they thinking during the Revolutionary period?
Yeah, and I mean, I think Christians certainly should advocate for, Christian biblical morality in law when it comes to things like, pro-life, and I mean that definitely is separation of church and state does not preclude Christians and friendly fellow travelers from arguing. I mean, because all law is based on morality. So I mean, you have to just pick what kind of morality you prefer. And in 1776, it was Christian, biblical morality was we didn't live up to it in many ways, but it was sort of the guiding light for American law. However, from the Baptist point of view, the problem comes with the established churches. Most of the colonies had established churches. It was usually the Church of England, no surprise, because that was the British established church, and we were British colonies, and so the New England colonies had the Congregationalist Church, which is the old church of the Puritans. The Puritans founded the New England colonies, so that makes sense. But those churches and their legal backers tended to persecute Baptists. The Baptists in colonial America were seen as kind of freaks. I mean, just they were not liked, and because basically all other Christians practiced, infant baptism, and people just did not understand what was the matter with the Baptists that they would withhold baptism from babies. It was seen as cruel and bizarre, and so even on the eve of the Revolution in the 1760s and 70s, in places like Virginia, Baptists are being harassed, fined, beat up, jailed for illegal preaching. You had to get the government's permission to be able to hold evangelistic meetings and church services, and the Baptists just wouldn't do it. I mean, they would not. I don't have to have a government permission slip, to preach the gospel. And so, but this is the way that an established church works: is that it wouldn't just be the Anglican minister who would show up and bust up the Baptist meetings. They would get the sheriff to come and beat up Baptist pastors because the Anglican Church had state police backing, and they were the preferred church, and so the Baptists were not the preferred church, but very much so. And so the Baptists in general were supportive of the Revolution, though there were a pretty good number of Baptists who thought, well, look, I mean, a lot of these patriot leaders are the same people who are persecuting us. So why should we trust them? But when push came to shove, I mean, the Baptists were like, yeah, I mean, we think your case against British taxation and everything is compelling, but we would also like for you, if you want us to support the revolution, we would like for you to give us religious liberty. I mean, Baptists couldn't have chaplains in the Continental Army and the state militias because they were not the preferred denomination. And so the Baptists said, would you mind allowing us to have chaplains for like Baptist soldiers? Would that be okay with you? And so they kind of keep the pressure on about wanting religious freedom while at the same time being basically supportive of the revolution, which I'm really grateful for that they didn't just overlook the fact that many of these patriot leaders are not supporting religious liberty. And so there were good strides made towards religious liberty during the Revolution, and then that was sort of capped off by the Constitution not having an established church, and then the great kind of capstone moment is the First Amendment, where we said we're not going to have an established church. We're going to guarantee free exercise of religion for all people, and the Baptists were just thrilled with those developments.
That's where we see kind of the Baptist ideal, and we have, confessional language of like a free church and a free state is kind of what we're after. And so I mean, you can trace that all the way back to the same kind of feelings and thoughts and desires at the Revolution, I would guess.
Yeah, that's right. And obviously, no Baptists have wanted the state to be hostile towards Christianity, for goodness sake. I mean,
Yeah.
no, what they want is what you would call a free market of religion. That the main thing we want from the state is for the state to protect free exercise of religion. Otherwise, leave us alone. We don't know. We don't want your help. We certainly don't want to be persecuted by you. We just want you to leave us alone so that we can preach the gospel in freedom and do what churches are supposed to do. And that is, as the Baptist Faith and Message says, it's the Christian ideal is a free church, free from government meddling, free from government persecution, in a free state that basically the state is just ensuring free exercise of religion, and Bible-believing Christians will do what they do. Preach the gospel and see people converted to faith in Christ, and we'll handle that side of things. We don't want the government to get involved in that. This has never meant for Christians that we can't promote morality and law. As I said, that's the most normal thing in the world. It's not prevented by separation of church and state. And yeah, I mean, we certainly should be engaged in politics and voting for candidates who believe in Christian morality and ideally would reflect Christian integrity in their own lives. But we do not want a government-run church, and that's the Baptist tradition on these things.
I think that's super helpful because sometimes the broad brushes are it's this like uh Christian moment, or we're talking secularism, godless kind of secularism, but like none of the founders are thinking godlessness either, right? But also understanding some of the dangers of, and I think that probably is some of the Christian influence. Like we understand something of the nature of the human heart in ways that want them to guard against kind of an established state church that can go awry. And Baptists seem to always be on the pointing end of the sword in those situations. And so it's just fascinating to me to see how all those things are kind of mixing together.
Yeah, I mean, right. And to be fair, I mean, there were some of the founders, George Washington, John Adams, believed that there still should be established churches. And in Massachusetts, I mean, Massachusetts kept its state church until 1833 because the Constitution explicitly only limited Congress about creating an establishment of religion. So the states could still have established churches if they wanted to. But in 1776, the founders are sort of split because the traditional way is having a state church. I mean, the new idea is having full freedom of religion, but you can understand why the Baptists wanted that because, as you said, I mean, the established churches was always bad news for the Baptists. And, as soon as the government can start playing favorites, between denominations and so forth, that historically, that's just always been bad news for the Baptists.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kidd. We're going to take a short break. For those of you that are here in the room with us, we're going to take about 10 minutes. We've covered a good bit of historical ground. Hopefully, some of this was new information to you. Just for the next 10 minutes around your tables, we're going to talk about three things. Was there something Dr. Kidd has said so far that was new information to you? Was there anything you found particularly interesting or compelling? And is there something that you want to read more about? We want to be processing what we're hearing and then using that as impetus to learn more. So let's take a few minutes right now to discuss those things, and we'll bring it back in just a second. All right. Hopefully, your discussion was productive. We're going to talk in just the remaining few minutes that we have left a little bit about how we apply some of what we've learned in our current moment. So, Dr. Kidd, how do we think about, or how do you think about it as a Christian who's a church member who also is in a profession that's very much in the public eye? How do you think about the intersection between faith in the public square as a Baptist? I know that's a broad question, but what guidance would you have for how much those things should interact?
Well, it's important. I think, some Christians want to make it too close to the center of what we're about as Christians, but I think you're on very strong ground if you say, look, I mean, we live in a time where we have freedom to vote and contribute to the political system. Most Christians in history have not had that. So, I mean, it can't, what we're doing now is not like essential or normative for the Christian life. I mean, lots of Christians have lived under kings, which is part of what the revolution was about. Lots of Christians, including today, don't have the right to vote. Think about people in, China and other places without freedom, and they seem to be doing fine as far as doing what they need to do as Christians and in the church. And so our faith in the Lord and our involvement with the church is the center. But politics is important. At a minimum, we should obey the command of First Timothy 2 about praying for kings and those who are in authority. If we don't do anything else, I think that is something we have to do because we're commanded to do that as in Scripture. So I think we certainly should be doing that as churches. But because we live in a moment where we do have the opportunity to vote and weigh in on political and legal matters, I think it is certainly a stewardship issue that God has given us the ability to do that in this cultural moment. And so we should use our influence to, advocate for Christian morality in American law. And, sometimes the calculations that we have to make, I mean, we live in a broken world and we see that nowhere more clearly than in politics. Um, so, we're often faced with complicated choices and the lesser of two evils and candidates who don't, live up to everything we might ask for. But, then there are other times. I mean, I'm mindful here in Missouri, we've had repeated, ballot initiatives that the only question they're asking is whether we should have more or less abortion.
Mm.
It's not really a partisan issue. It's not connected to parties. And
Mhm.
that's a moment where, for me as a Christian, I think you can get pretty close to saying, if you're able to vote, you should show up at the polls and vote for life. I mean, that's just an opportunity the Lord has given us in this place and time. But most of the political calculations that we make are more complicated. So we certainly don't want to impose on people's consciences. We don't want to make our churches sort of campaign stops for politicians. That's certainly not what Sunday morning is for. We need to keep the focus on the Lord and worshiping and all that. So whether left or right or whatever, I'm very hesitant about ever kind of giving our churches over to kind of visiting politicians and things like that. We don't want to communicate that we're basically an adjunct office of some political party.
Mm.
But I think we can really press into certainly praying for leaders and advocating for Christian morality and law.
You kind of mentioned this earlier, but like you can't get around that. Like everyone's bringing some kind of morality to the table when we
Yes.
adjudicate law. Like everyone is doing that, and so we as Christians don't need to leave ours at the door, so to speak. I mean, that's all we're doing in lawmaking essentially is making
Yeah,
moral decisions.
right. And yeah, I mean, I've taught legal history classes in my career when I was at Baylor for 20 years, and I would tell the students, look, you'll hear people say you can't legislate morality. And when you think about it, that's just a dumb thing to say. I mean, because all law, especially criminal law, is based on ideas of morality.
Mm.
You can't steal my truck because that's considered immoral. And so I think where secular people get confused about this is they don't that's there's just such a consensus about that they don't see that it's actually based on an idea about morality.
Mm.
And so what I think people mean is that in the absence of consensus, say on abortion or on what marriage is or something like that, in the absence of consensus, it can be difficult to just, slap a law down and generate consensus. And that's true. I mean, the Supreme Court tried to do that with the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. There was never consensus about the morality of abortion. And so now, here you are 30 years later, you get, 50 years later, you get the Dobbs decision and overturning Roe v. Wade, and we still don't have consensus about it. But Christians should keep making the argument, and the pro-life issue is one that I feel the most strongly about, that we should protect unborn life, that babies are good, that we should protect and not destroy unborn human life, and just keep making the case. And when we have opportunity to vote that way, that's just the most natural thing in the world for Christians to do. Secular people have, their own code of morality. They think that the individual's privacy and ability to do what they want is kind of the ultimate moral code. Um, I like individual liberty, but it is not the ultimate test of morality.
Mm.
And so we should, advocate, hopefully persuasively, winsomely, and on something like pro-life. I mean, we're advocating for the life of unborn children. I mean, this is not some mean,
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I think that there would be broad consensus about some kind of default to protecting life if people just understood the issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost like we can't not legislate morality. And that's all we're always doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know we are just have a few minutes left. There's two questions we wanted to ask you. One related to why historical work matters just for the Christian life. But before we get to that, I know Christian nationalism is kind of a buzzword today. There may be a million definitions out there about that, but I know you get questions about this as a historian. How do you think about Christian nationalism? Is that a good thing? Tied into that is just patriotism as an American and as a Christian. What advice would you give the average church person who's, hearing about Christian nationalism, wondering whether it's a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, there's a ton of confusion about Christian nationalism because when it shows up in the secular media, it basically means Christians on the right who think that their faith has political implications, which is just a silly definition, and it makes the term Christian nationalism useless because I think most Christians on the left or the right or whoever we're talking, I mean, most Christians think that their faith has something to do with politics.
Mm.
So it effectively makes like everybody who says they're a Christian nationalist, and that's just silly. Um, on the other end of the spectrum, there is an increased interest among conservative Christians in having a more formal state role for promoting Christianity at the expense of secularism or other religions. Um, and if the idea is, as I've said, that we should promote Christian morality in law, then I suppose I would count as a Christian nationalist, because I kind of don't think we have any other option. Um, as a Baptist, I do get queasy when you start talking about having some sort of formal role between the church and a church and the state, or getting the state involved in saying what's Christian and what's not. The state is not the agency that should be doing that. The church is is the one that calls theological balls and strikes and defines what a Christian is. Hopefully, the church is using the Word of God to do that, but the government is not to be doing that sort of thing. So we could talk about individual issues, but my basic point is that I think Christians and Baptists in particular should just always remember that the government tends to corrupt things that it touches. And so we just do not want the government to get involved in running a church, making decisions for a church, telling Americans what Christian is, because as soon as we do that, you can bet that that power will be turned against some or all points of Bible believing Christian doctrine and theology. And I do not want us to be nostalgic and wishing to go back to something like the Church of England. I mean, look what the Church of England is today in Britain. It's a complete farce. It is an utter embarrassment. It is a mockery of Christianity, and we shouldn't want even to take baby steps towards that sort of situation.
So I think we have biblical and theological reasons for that, but also just kind of on a even more pragmatic historical ones. Like you could go back through the historical record and see that doesn't work. It really doesn't work all the time. Maybe just a general question. Why is it important for regular, everyday Christians to do good kind of historical work? I appreciate the nuance you brought in even this conversation about we want to look at the facts as they are, but not draw conclusions that are kind of too broad from what the facts can give us. Well, why is it important for us as Christians to be good historians?
Yeah, I mean, and I don't want to oversell it. I mean, history is one important topic among a number of important topics.
And your unbiased, your unbiased opinion as a history professor, why is that important?
Well, and I'm speaking here as a churchman first. I mean, if you have to make a choice about what to read, I would read the Bible first. But we're also told that there's a cloud of witnesses in Hebrews that people who've gone before us and who have been courageous. I think about the history of missionaries and great Christian leaders and theologians and just faithful everyday Christians. And so it really is a mistake to think, well, my Christian faith is just about me and Jesus. It is about me and Jesus, but we're also part not only of the body of Christ in our local, congregation today, but also in history. And so, take just somebody like Jonathan Edwards, who's one of my Christian heroes. I mean, if I have a choice of being ignorant about Jonathan Edwards or knowing some things about him and his incredibly powerful writings on theology and revival and the Great Awakening and all this, it would be better for me to know about it as a Christian, right? I mean, it's incredibly edifying. It shows me, the perseverance and the long suffering of people who've gone before me, and that's just very helpful in all kinds of ways, not only intellectually, but just in terms of my Christian walk. So, instead of scrolling through Instagram or something, which we seem to have plenty of time to do, it would be better, I think, to, expose ourselves to, great heroes of the Christian past, men and women, Lottie Moon, great missionaries, Adoniram Judson. These, I mean, there's such a long list, but we would do well to not choose to be ignorant to those people, but instead to learn from them and what the Lord did in their lives and be encouraged in our day and time by their example.
Yeah, that's been, I know, super huge in my own life, just to kind of steady my own faith and to keep my eyes fixed on Jesus. And I was talking with Kurt even earlier this week, as Christians, like our message is a historical claim. that a real person named Jesus, who was the Son of God, like really did die on a cross in a particular place and rose again from the grave. So like to have shoddy history in other places might undermine this historical message that has a lot of theological import as well. It's important that we be truth tellers. And so I appreciate the way that you do that in your historical research and writings.
As we get ready to wrap up, I know you have a large number of writing projects that are going to be coming out, and then revisions of previous writing projects. Our folks have heard me talk about your American history textbooks. I know several of our homeschool families use that. And then I just recently read your Jefferson biography of Spirit and Flesh, which is fascinating. If you could, so two questions about your writing work. If you could just recommend one book for the average churchman who has never read any of your work, what would it be? And then what's a project that you're excited about that we should be on the lookout for in the coming days?
Yeah, well, I know a lot of homeschoolers do use my American history, and also Christian private schools they use my American history textbook. I mean, it is a textbook, so if you are not an educator, a home educator or otherwise, it might not be what you would choose first because it is an overview instead of strictly a narrative. Um, yeah, I think that I've written a number of founders' biographies. Sometimes I think maybe Patrick Henry is the one that I would start with if because I think it may be the most accessible, and it is about a Christian founder. And that's one of the reasons I wrote it, is because I wanted to think about how does the revolution work for a distinctively Christian founder where there's just no doubt about his faith. Next book out is a little bit different project because it's co-authored with a guy named Byron Johnson, a sociologist colleague of mine at Baylor, and the book is called The Death of Religion, ? Nuns, Others, and the Flourishing of Faith, and it's going to be out in September 2026. And it's basically taking on this question of like, who are the nones, N-O-N-E-S, the people who say that they have no religion? Are they taking over American and world religion? Is Christianity falling apart? And to get the short answer, it's no, Christianity is not falling apart. It has challenges. It's changing all the time. Christianity is, that's just the history of Christianity, is its configuration and growth and decline and all that is always changing. But the Lord's on his throne, and Christianity's actually doing great. So it's sort of a contrarian narrative to the idea that the world is falling apart and Christianity is in collapse.
Wonderful. Well, we appreciate it. We'll be on the lookout for those. And thank you again for taking the time with us. We're going to close for folks that are in the room, just spending a few more minutes thinking about conversations that you have had, perhaps with family members, perhaps with coworkers, about faith in the public square, especially as it relates to elections. What conversations have you had? And then how do you think your conversations might be different moving forward after our time together? But Dr. Kidd, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate you as always and look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks for having me.